I never thought a quiet maid with dirt under her nails could bring down a millionaire. There was a bitter laugh in the courtroom that day, cold, sharp, dismissive, echoing around those marble walls. But then, everything changed. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're folding laundry, nursing a late-night coffee, or sitting quietly after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. The morning mist rolled off Lake Michigan like whispered prayers, shrouding Chicago's towering skyline in a gray embrace. From her cramped apartment window on South Ashland Avenue, Maria Esperanza watched the city awaken, a metropolis where glass towers kissed the clouds while weathered hands like hers scrubbed their foundations clean. At 53, Maria had learned that the distance between those who commanded millions and those who served in silence wasn't measured in miles, but in worlds. Her reflection stared back from the cracked bathroom mirror. Dark eyes that had seen too much, hands that had worked too hard, silver threading through black hair, she pulled back into the same tired bun every morning. The scent of café de olla still lingered from her mother's old pot, a ritual that connected her to memories of better days. Maria's fingers traced the worn rosary beads hanging from the mirror's edge, whispering a prayer that had become as automatic as breathing. 23 floors above the bustling streets of North Lakeshore Drive, Robert Aldridge stood behind floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the lakefront like an expensive painting. His penthouse mansion, a testament to decades of ruthless real estate investments and stock market victories, stretched across 4,000 square feet of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and suffocating silence. The Wall Street Journal lay folded beside his cold coffee, headlines announcing another record-breaking quarter for Aldridge Holdings. His net worth had crossed the billion-dollar mark 3 months ago, yet the numbers on his cryptocurrency portfolio meant nothing when he woke to empty hallways and rooms that echoed with ghosts. Robert's reflection in the window showed a man carved from ambition and disappointment. At 48, his dark hair was streaked with premature gray, his jaw set in permanent tension. The Armani suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost since Caroline left. Taking their 2 children to California after discovering his affair with a business partner. The divorce settlement had cost him $50 million in assets, plus monthly payments that would fund a small country. Yet the financial blow paled compared to the hollow ache that no amount of money could fill. The house breathed with mechanical precision, climate control maintaining the perfect 72 degrees, automated systems managing everything from security to lighting. But it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The staff moved through their routines with professional detachment. Harold, the aging butler whose loyalty came with a 6-figure salary. Mrs. Whitman, the head housekeeper who managed the domestic army with military efficiency. Thomas, the personal chef whose culinary artistry was wasted on Robert's diminished appetite. Maria's journey began before dawn, as it had for the past 8 years since her husband Miguel died from complications of diabetes. The CTA bus rumbled through neighborhoods that told Chicago's story in layers, from the vibrant murals of Pilsen where she lived, through the gentrified corridors of Lincoln Park, finally depositing her at the Gold Coast where money insulated the wealthy from the city's harsher realities. Her uniform, a simple black dress with white collar, waited in a plastic bag beside her purse, containing her work permit, a worn photograph of her late daughter Carmen, and exactly $17 until next Friday. The employment agency had been blunt. Mr. Aldridge was difficult, demanding, and had dismissed 4 housekeepers in 6 months. The pay was exceptional, more than Maria had ever earned, but the warnings were clear. He didn't tolerate mistakes, personal conversations, or what he called emotional complications. Maria had simply nodded, understanding that desperation made choices for people like her. Her rent was 3 months behind, her arthritis medication cost more than groceries, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. The Aldridge mansion loomed against the morning sky like a fortress of wealth and isolation. Maria approached the service entrance as instructed, her shoes clicking against imported Italian marble that cost more than most people's cars. The kitchen alone could have housed 3 families, sub-zero refrigerators, professional-grade appliances, and a center island carved from a single piece of granite. Everything gleamed with the sterile perfection that money could buy, yet somehow felt cold as a morgue. Mrs. Meadow Whitman's inspection was thorough and humiliating. She examined Maria's references with pursed lips, made note of her address with obvious disdain, and explained the house rules with the precision of a drill sergeant. No personal calls, no fraternizing with other staff, no touching Mr. Aldridge's personal items, and absolutely no opinions about family matters. Maria absorbed each instruction with quiet dignity, her hands folded, her expression neutral despite the burning in her chest. Harold's introduction to Mr. Aldridge was brief and dismissive. Robert barely glanced up from his tablet, where cryptocurrency prices fluctuated like a digital heartbeat. His acknowledgement was a grunt, his instructions delivered through Harold rather than directly to Maria. She was to clean the third-floor guest wing, maintain the library, and ensure his home office remained undisturbed. Her presence should be invisible, her work flawless, her existence forgotten the moment she left each evening. The other staff watched Maria with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Rosa, the young Guatemalan girl who helped with laundry, whispered warnings about Mr. Aldridge's temper. James, the groundskeeper, shared knowing looks with the maintenance crew when Maria passed. They had seen housekeepers come and go, each one carrying hopes that were methodically crushed by Robert's emotional unavailability and impossible standards. Maria's first week was a masterclass in endurance. She scrubbed marble that was already spotless, polished silver that gleamed unused in forgotten cabinets, and arranged fresh flowers in rooms where no one paused to notice their beauty. The house absorbed her efforts without acknowledgement, its silence broken only by the mechanical hum of money-funded perfection. Robert's presence was a shadow, arriving late, leaving early, communicating only through Harold's transmitted instructions. But Maria saw what others missed. She noticed the untouched dinner plates outside Robert's office, evidence of meals ignored in favor of endless conference calls with investment managers and cryptocurrency advisors. She observed the prescription bottles hidden behind expensive whiskey, sleeping pills, antidepressants, medication for the anxiety that no portfolio diversification could cure. Most telling were the photographs turned face down on his desk, images of the family that fortress-like wealth had failed to protect. The house revealed its secrets slowly. In forgotten drawers, Maria found children's artwork signed "Love Emma" and "Dad Best Ever Tommy," crayon masterpieces that had once decorated refrigerators, now gathering dust in rooms that money couldn't warm. She discovered birthday cards never sent, airline tickets for family vacations that never happened, and legal documents outlining custody arrangements that read like battle plans rather than love letters. Maria cleaned around these artifacts of a broken family with reverence, understanding that some wounds ran deeper than financial losses. Her own losses, Miguel's death, Carmen's car accident that stole their only child at 19, had taught her that grief was a language spoken in silence, a weight carried in shoulders that never quite straightened. When she found Robert's wedding album abandoned in a storage closet, she simply placed it carefully in a drawer, knowing that some memories were too precious to discard, too painful to display. The rhythm of wealthy isolation became Maria's daily reality. She moved through rooms designed to impress but never comfort, past art collections worth millions that no one paused to appreciate. The house was a monument to success that felt more like a prison, its luxury suffocating rather than liberating. Money had purchased everything except the one thing Robert needed most: connection to another human soul. The staff dining room buzzed with gossip about their employer's latest business triumph, a downtown development project that had netted Aldridge Holdings another $100 million in projected profits. Stock options, dividend payments, and investment returns were discussed with the casual familiarity of people whose livelihoods depended on one man's financial success. Yet Maria noticed that none of them spoke about Robert as a person, only as a source of carefully managed paychecks and benefits packages. Mrs. Whitman's evaluation at week's end was grudgingly positive. Maria's work was thorough, her demeanor appropriately invisible, her presence unremarkable enough to continue. But there was something in the older woman's eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of another survivor who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters where dignity met necessity. Maria accepted the assessment without comment, understanding that praise from people like Mrs. Whitman was measured in the absence of criticism rather than the presence of warmth. As autumn painted Chicago in shades of gold and amber, Maria settled into the fortress of silence that was the Aldridge mansion. Each morning brought the same routine: early arrival, methodical work, invisible presence, yet something was shifting in the carefully controlled atmosphere. Perhaps it was the way Maria arranged flowers with gentle hands, or how she hummed softly while working, unconscious melodies from her childhood that floated through sterile rooms like forgotten prayers. Maria's journey from Pilsen to Lakeshore Drive was more than a commute across a city. It was a daily crossing between worlds where the distance was measured not in miles but in dreams deferred, hopes postponed, and the quiet courage of women who kept other people's lives beautiful while their own remained hidden in shadows. Yet something was stirring in that magnificent prison of wealth, something that no amount of money could purchase and no investment strategy could predict. The first crack in Robert Aldridge's carefully constructed isolation came on a Tuesday morning when autumn rain drummed against bulletproof windows. Maria arrived to find the kitchen in chaos, shattered crystal scattered across Italian marble, the remnants of what had been a priceless decanter hurled against the wall. Harold stood frozen in the doorway, his usual composure shattered along with the expensive glassware, while Mrs. Whitman wrung her hands and muttered about calling the cleaning service. Maria surveyed the destruction without comment, her experienced eyes cataloging the damage while her heart recognized the pain behind it. She had cleaned up after grief before, in her own home after Miguel's diagnosis, in her daughter's apartment after the accident that stole Carmen's future along with her young life. Broken glass was just broken glass. The real damage was always invisible, lodged deep in places that money couldn't reach or mend. Without waiting for permission, Maria fetched her supplies. She worked methodically, her weathered hands carefully gathering each shard while the rest of the staff watched in uncomfortable silence. The glass caught the morning light as she swept, sending tiny rainbows across the floor, beauty emerging from destruction, hope glimmering in the midst of brokenness. Harold finally found his voice to stammer apologies and explanations about Mr. Aldridge's difficult morning, but Maria simply nodded and continued her work. The sound of Robert's footsteps on the stairs sent the other staff scurrying to their duties, but Maria remained kneeling on the kitchen floor, carefully checking for missed fragments that could cut unwary feet. When his shadow fell across her workspace, she looked up to meet eyes that held the hollow exhaustion of a man who had lost everything that mattered, despite possessing everything money could buy. "I'll replace the decanter," Robert said gruffly, his voice carrying the rough edge of someone who had spent the night wrestling with demons that quarterly reports couldn't vanquish. His hands shook slightly as he straightened his tie, and Maria noticed the prescription bottle peeking from his jacket pocket, anxiety medication that clearly wasn't working anymore. "It was just glass, Mr. Aldridge," Maria replied quietly, her accent wrapping around the words like a gentle embrace. "Glass can always be replaced." Her eyes held his for a moment longer than appropriate, and in that brief connection, something passed between them, an acknowledgement that some things, once broken, could never be made whole again. The kitchen fell silent except for the whisper of Maria's broom against marble. Robert stood transfixed, watching this woman who cleaned his destruction without judgment, who knelt on floors that cost more than most people's homes, yet maintained her dignity in the gesture. For the first time in months, he noticed details: the careful way she wrapped the shards in newspaper, the gentle humming that resumed once she thought he'd left, the small crucifix that hung from her neck and caught the light like a beacon. Over the following weeks, small gestures began to change the atmosphere of the mansion. Maria started arriving 15 minutes early to brew fresh coffee, filling the kitchen with aromas that hadn't graced those sterile rooms in months. She replaced the white silk flowers in Robert's office with living blooms, simple daisies and carnations from the discount shop near her bus stop, their modest beauty somehow more vibrant than the expensive arrangements the florist had been delivering. The changes were subtle but profound. Maria's soft humming drifted through hallways that had known only the mechanical sounds of wealth, climate control systems, security monitors, the electronic chiming of notifications from investment apps. Her presence introduced something the mansion had been missing, the gentle rhythm of human habitation, the warmth that came from someone who cared about the space they inhabited rather than simply maintained it. Robert found himself lingering in areas where Maria worked, drawn by something he couldn't name. He watched from doorways as she tended to details that previous housekeepers had ignored, straightening family photographs with reverent care, watering plants that had been slowly dying in their expensive pots, opening curtains to let natural light compete with the artificial illumination that had kept the mansion dim as a tomb. The first real conversation happened by accident. Maria was in the library, carefully dusting the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls, first editions in rare books worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, yet clearly unread for years. She had discovered a slim volume of Pablo Neruda's poetry wedged behind more impressive tomes, its pages soft with age and handling. When Robert entered unexpectedly, she quickly moved to replace the book, but he caught sight of the title. "You read poetry?" he asked, genuine surprise replacing his usual curtness. The question hung in the air between them, bridging the careful distance that employer and employee were supposed to maintain. Maria's hand stilled on the book's spine, and for a moment, the library held its breath. "My daughter loved Neruda," Maria replied softly, her fingers tracing the worn cover. "She was studying to be a teacher before—" Her voice trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished but complete in its implications. Robert had seen that look before, in his own mirror after Caroline left, in the eyes of other parents who had learned that money couldn't protect the people you loved. Was? The question escaped before Robert could stop himself, his voice gentler than it had been in months. Maria's smile was sad but beautiful, carrying the weight of loss transformed into something approaching peace. "She died 5 years ago. Car accident on the Dan Ryan." The words were simple, but they carried the gravity of a mother's worst nightmare made real. "She gave this to me for my birthday, said I needed beauty in my life." Maria's laugh held notes of tears long cried and accepted. "Carmen always said poetry was like prayer, but with better words." Robert stood motionless, the familiar weight of loss settling in his chest. His children were alive but lost to him, stolen by his own failures and pride. This woman had buried a daughter who loved poetry and still found the strength to dust other people's books, to find beauty in abandoned spaces, to show up each morning with grace intact, despite carrying grief that would have destroyed lesser souls. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in a way that surprised them both. Maria nodded acknowledgement, her eyes bright with unshed tears that she wouldn't allow to fall during work hours. She replaced the Neruda volume carefully, but Robert noticed she positioned it where it could be easily found again, a small defiance against the library's formal order. That evening, Robert found himself reading Neruda for the first time in years. The poem spoke of love and loss, of finding beauty in broken places, of the strength it took to remain human in a world that often demanded otherwise. He thought of Maria's daughter, of poetry as prayer, of the grace required to dust another person's books when your own child would never read again. The mansion felt different that night, less like a mausoleum, and more like a place where living people might actually dwell. Through his office window, Robert watched Maria's bus disappear into the city's evening symphony, carrying her back to a modest apartment in Pilsen where she kept her daughter's poetry books and brewed coffee in her mother's old pot. For the first time in months, the silence in his mansion felt less like punishment and more like possibility. Winter arrived in Chicago like an unwelcome creditor, demanding payment in frozen pipes and heating bills that would bankrupt ordinary families. But inside the Aldridge mansion, something warmer than central heating had begun to take hold, the gradual thawing of a heart that wealth had frozen solid. Maria's presence had become as essential as the automated systems that maintained the house's perfect temperature, yet infinitely more valuable than any technology money could install. The transformation began in small ways that even the other staff noticed. The kitchen, once sterile as an operating room, now carried the lingering sense of Maria's simple meals: beans and rice prepared during her lunch break, coffee brewed with the patience of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. She had begun preparing extra portions, leaving covered plates for Rosa, who worked double shifts to support her family, or Harold, whose arthritis made evening meal preparation painful. Robert's eating habits, which had deteriorated to delivered takeout consumed at his desk between cryptocurrency trades and real estate calls, gradually improved as Maria's gentle interventions took effect. She never overstepped boundaries, never presumed to cook for him directly, but somehow fresh fruit appeared beside his morning coffee, and simple sandwiches materialized on his desk during long afternoons when he forgot that bodies required fuel beyond caffeine and ambition. The house staff had initially viewed Maria with the suspicious distance that longtime employees reserved for newcomers who might upset established hierarchies. But her consistent kindness and work ethic gradually won over even the most skeptical. Mrs. Whitman, typically stern and unyielding, began seeking Maria's opinion on flower arrangements and holiday decorations. Harold, proud of his formal training and British reserve, found himself sharing family photographs and stories of his grandchildren in Wales. Thomas, the temperamental chef whose culinary artistry was wasted on Robert's diminished appetite, discovered that Maria possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of comfort foods that could coax even the most reluctant palate. She shared recipes passed down through generations of women who had learned to create miracles from modest ingredients, knowledge worth more than the expensive cookbooks that lined Thomas's shelves. Most remarkably, Maria had begun to restore life to rooms that had been closed off since Caroline's departure. The sunroom, where Robert's children had once done homework and built blanket forts, slowly reopened under Maria's gentle care. She cleaned windows that hadn't seen proper attention in months, revealing views of Lake Michigan that money had purchased, but despair had hidden. Plants began appearing, hardy species that could survive neglect, their green presence softening spaces that had been beautifully sterile. Robert found himself drawn to these restored areas, initially telling himself he was merely inspecting Maria's work. But truthfully, he was drawn by something more profound, the evidence that spaces could be redeemed, that care and attention could restore what anger and loneliness had damaged. He watched Maria tend to a small herb garden she had started on the kitchen windowsill, her weathered hands gentle with seedlings that promised future meals and present hope. The first snow of the season transformed Chicago into a wonderland that money couldn't buy and poverty couldn't steal. Maria arrived that morning with snowflakes melting in her hair and her usual quiet smile, bringing news that the city had declared a snow emergency and that public transportation might be disrupted. She had left her apartment 2 hours earlier than usual, walking part of the distance through neighborhoods where snow removal was a luxury rather than a given priority. Robert, monitoring weather reports that threatened his afternoon meetings with investment advisors, found himself more concerned about Maria's evening commute than his own financial consultations. When Harold mentioned that several staff members were planning to leave early to beat the storm, Robert made an unprecedented decision. He offered to have his driver take anyone who needed transportation, ensuring they could get home safely rather than risk the dangerous combination of Chicago weather and overloaded public transit. Maria's gratitude was quiet but profound. She had spent years working for people who considered her transportation challenges irrelevant to their concerns, employers who expected perfect attendance regardless of weather, health, or family emergencies. The simple courtesy of concern for her safety was a gift worth more than the overtime pay she often sacrificed to arrive on time, despite challenging commutes. That evening's drive through snow-covered Chicago became an unexpected revelation for Robert, who rarely saw the city from street level. Sitting beside Maria in the back of his Mercedes, he witnessed her neighborhood with eyes unclouded by windshields or preconceptions. Pilsen revealed itself as a community where modest homes glowed with warmth that no interior designer could create, where corner stores and family restaurants provided gathering places that his expensive clubs couldn't replicate. Maria's apartment building, solid and well-maintained despite its age, stood as a testament to working families who took pride in their surroundings regardless of property values or investment potential. When she thanked him for the ride, her words simple and sincere, Robert realized that this woman who cleaned his floors and dusted his books lived a life richer in community and connection than his mansion had provided, despite its astronomical market value. Climbing the stairs to her third-floor apartment, Maria paused at her window to watch the Mercedes disappear into the swirling snow. For just a moment, she had seen something in Robert Aldridge's eyes, not the distant courtesy of employer to employee, but the recognition of one human being acknowledging another. It was a small crack in the wall that wealth and position had built around him, barely visible but potentially profound. Inside her modest home, surrounded by photographs of Carmen and Miguel, by her mother's old furniture and her daughter's poetry books, Maria prepared her simple dinner and thought about the man who owned so much, but seemed to possess so little of what made life worth living. Tomorrow she would return to his mansion, would clean his rooms and tend his spaces, but tonight she offered a prayer for healing that no medical prescription could provide and no financial portfolio could guarantee. The blizzard that buried Chicago in 18 inches of snow became a strange gift to the Aldridge mansion, creating an enforced intimacy that money normally couldn't buy and pride typically wouldn't allow. With most of the staff unable to reach the house due to transportation emergencies, and with Robert's business meetings canceled by weather that ignored quarterly projections, the mansion settled into an unusual quiet that had nothing to do with emptiness and everything to do with unexpected companionship. Maria had arrived before dawn, walking the final 2 miles through snow that reached her knees, determined not to leave Robert completely alone in his fortress of wealth and isolation. She found him in the kitchen at sunrise, standing before the massive windows that framed Lake Michigan's frozen beauty, holding a mug of coffee with hands that shook slightly from more than cold. His usual armor of expensive suits had been replaced by simple jeans and a sweater, making him appear almost human rather than merely successful. "You didn't need to come," Robert said when he noticed her removing her snow-covered coat, but his voice held relief rather than dismissal. The kitchen, designed to serve elaborate dinner parties and formal entertainments, felt almost cozy with just the two of them present, the storm having stripped away the artificial barriers that position and propriety normally maintained. "Snow stops buses, not responsibility," Maria replied gently, her practical wisdom cutting through the assumptions that wealth created about other people's dedication. She began her morning routine, not the formal service that Mrs. Whitman's protocols demanded, but the natural rhythm of someone creating home rather than merely maintaining property. Without the usual staff hierarchy to navigate, Maria and Robert found themselves occupying the same spaces in ways that previous months hadn't allowed. She prepared breakfast while he dealt with emergency calls from property managers whose high-rise tenants were dealing with power outages and heating failures, reminders that even great wealth couldn't completely insulate anyone from the democratic inconvenience of natural disasters. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The storm that trapped them together had also freed them from the elaborate protocols that normally governed their interactions. Maria moved through the kitchen with easy familiarity, preparing meals simple enough for the gas stove when the power flickered uncertainly. Robert found himself helping without being asked, his hands learning tasks that money had always delegated to others, peeling potatoes, stirring soup, setting a table for two rather than formal dinner parties designed to impress rather than nourish. Conversation emerged gradually, like snow melting to reveal what had been hidden beneath. Robert spoke about his children's last visit, when Tommy had built a blanket fort in the sunroom, and Emma had tried to teach him card games he'd been too busy to learn properly. His voice carried the hollow ache of a father who had possessed everything needed to provide for his family, except the time and emotional availability that would have made the providing meaningful. Maria listened without judgment, her hands busy with simple tasks while her heart recognized the particular pain of loving people you couldn't reach. She shared stories of Carmen's childhood, not the tragedy of her death, but the joy she had brought to their modest apartment in Pilsen. The bedtime stories read by flashlight during power outages that Con Ed couldn't prevent, the birthday parties celebrated with homemade cake and dollar store decorations that outshone any purchased entertainment. The power failed completely as evening approached, leaving them with candlelight that transformed the kitchen from a showcase of expensive appliances into something approaching intimacy. Maria produced candles from her purse, practical supplies she carried for emergencies that wealth couldn't prevent, and their warm light revealed expressions softened by circumstances that money couldn't control and position couldn't mandate. "I never learned to cook," Robert admitted as they shared soup that Maria had prepared from ingredients found in his underutilized pantry. The confession carried weight beyond its simple words, an acknowledgement of how thoroughly his pursuit of financial success had separated him from basic human skills, how completely he had delegated the fundamental acts of caring for himself and others. "It's never too late," Maria replied, her voice carrying the patient wisdom of someone who had learned that survival often required mastering skills that convenience could eliminate but circumstances might demand. She showed him how to adjust seasoning by taste rather than recipe, how to judge doneness by sight and sound rather than expensive thermometers, how to create satisfaction from simple ingredients rather than elaborate preparations. As the storm continued its assault on Chicago's infrastructure, Maria and Robert found themselves in a situation that no amount of money could have purchased and no social protocols could have arranged. They were simply two people, keeping each other company, while nature reminded them both that the most fundamental human needs, warmth, food, companionship, existed beyond the complications that wealth and poverty typically created. The mansion's silence, usually oppressive in its evidence of emotional emptiness, became companionable in the candlelight. Maria's presence filled spaces that expensive furnishings had decorated but never warmed, while Robert's gradual emergence from behind walls of professional distance revealed glimpses of the man he might have been if success hadn't demanded the sacrifice of so much that made living worthwhile. Outside, Chicago slept under its blanket of snow, the city temporarily equalized by weather that affected rich and poor alike. Inside the mansion, two people who lived in worlds normally separated by walls more formidable than any blizzard discovered that storms sometimes cleared the air in ways that fair weather never could. When morning came and the storm finally exhausted itself, both Maria and Robert emerged changed by 24 hours that money couldn't have bought and circumstances couldn't have planned. The mansion would soon return to its normal rhythms, staff would resume their hierarchical positions, and the protocols of employer and employee would reassert their careful boundaries. But something fundamental had shifted in that space between them, a recognition that wealth and poverty were simply different forms of shelter from the same human vulnerabilities, and that dignity existed independently of bank account balances or property values. Spring arrived in Chicago with the democratic enthusiasm of grass pushing through sidewalk cracks, bringing renewal to places where none seemed possible. The Aldridge mansion, once frozen in the artificial perfection that money could maintain but couldn't animate, began showing signs of genuine life under Maria's gentle influence. The transformation wasn't dramatic. No interior designers were consulted, no expensive consultations with lifestyle experts, but rather the gradual warming that occurred when someone who understood home, rather than merely shelter, applied her knowledge to spaces that had forgotten their purpose. Maria's daily routine had evolved beyond the strict protocols Mrs. Whitman had originally outlined. While she still maintained the impeccable standards that Robert's wealth demanded, her approach had become less mechanical and more intuitive. She opened windows to welcome spring breezes that carried the scent of Lake Michigan into rooms that had been climate-controlled into sterility. Plants appeared throughout the house, not the expensive arrangements from florists who charged premium prices for temporary beauty, but living things that could flourish with proper care and regular attention. The kitchen had become Maria's domain in ways that went beyond mere cleaning and maintenance. She had gradually taken over meal preparation from Thomas, whose elaborate culinary artistry had proven unsuited to Robert's actual needs and preferences. Maria's food was simple but nourishing. Soups that simmered slowly on back burners, bread that filled the kitchen with aromas money couldn't purchase, vegetables from the farmer's market that she visited during her Saturday morning trips to restock her own modest pantry. Robert found himself spending more time in the kitchen, initially claiming he needed to review investment reports while eating, but actually drawn by something harder to quantify. The space felt alive in ways his formal dining room never had, warm with the evidence of hands that cared about the food they prepared, rather than simply the presentation they achieved. Maria's quiet presence provided something he hadn't realized he needed, the companionable silence of someone comfortable in her own skin, unimpressed by wealth but respectful of the person who possessed it. Their conversations had deepened beyond polite acknowledgments and work-related instructions. Maria shared stories of her girlhood in a small town outside Guadalajara, where her mother had run a boarding house for workers heading north to seek opportunities that Mexico's economy couldn't provide. Robert found himself describing his own childhood, not the prepared biography he typically shared with business associates, but the genuine memories of a middle-class boy whose father had built a modest construction company through persistent hard work rather than inherited advantages. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Maria's journey north had eventually led her to clean the floors of a man who had traveled his own path, from working-class origins to enormous wealth, yet somehow they had arrived at the same place of fundamental loneliness. Money had built walls around Robert that were as isolating as the poverty that had limited Maria's choices, and success had demanded sacrifices that left him poorer in ways that no financial advisor could address. One afternoon in late April, while Maria tended to the herb garden she had started in the mansion's unused conservatory, Robert joined her among the plants that transformed expensive space into something approaching Eden. His hands, more familiar with computer keyboards than soil, tentatively helped transplant seedlings that would eventually flavor meals shared in the kitchen that had become the house's emotional center. "My grandmother had gardens like this," Robert said, his voice carrying surprise at the memory. "Behind our cottage in Wisconsin. She said herbs were proof that God wanted cooking to be more than just survival." His smile was nostalgic and slightly sad, acknowledging dreams that wealth had traded for opportunities his grandmother never could have imagined. "Mine too," Maria replied, her weathered fingers gentle with the basil seedlings that would soon perfume summer evenings. She said plants teach patience. You can't hurry growth, only provide what's needed and trust the natural process. Her words carried layers of meaning that had nothing to do with gardening and everything to do with the slow transformation occurring between them. The conservatory, which had been another showcase room displaying expensive plants maintained by professional services, gradually became a genuine garden under Maria's care. She chose varieties that could thrive rather than simply impress, tomatoes that would actually ripen into sweetness, peppers that would add genuine flavor to simple meals, flowers that attracted butterflies rather than admiring glances from visitors who never came. Robert's investment in this space went beyond the monetary costs of soil and seeds. He found himself researching growing techniques between conference calls with cryptocurrency advisors, learning the difference between annual and perennial plants from websites that charged nothing for wisdom his expensive education hadn't provided. The physical act of planting and watering became a meditation that no expensive therapy had successfully offered. The mansion's other rooms remained showcases of wealth and good taste, but the conservatory became something unprecedented, a space where Robert Aldrich's money served life rather than image, where simple growth mattered more than impressive display. Maria worked alongside him without comment on the transformation, understanding that healing happened gradually, like seeds sprouting in soil that patience and proper attention had prepared. Their partnership in the garden created an intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with recognition. Two people who had learned that the most essential things couldn't be purchased or inherited, only cultivated through daily attention and care. Robert's wealth remained vast. His business empire continued generating profits that most people couldn't comprehend. But for the first time in years, his investment of time and attention was producing something that could nourish rather than simply impress. As spring deepened into early summer, the conservatory bloomed with evidence that money, when combined with genuine care, could create beauty that served life rather than merely displaying success. Maria's knowledge and Robert's resources had combined to produce something neither could have achieved alone, a garden that grew food for the body and peace for the spirit, proof that the best investments required more than capital, demanding also the patience to tend what was planted and the wisdom to trust in growth that couldn't be hurried by any amount of wealth. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday morning in June, delivered with the casual brutality that catastrophe often employs when dismantling carefully constructed lives. Maria discovered the accusations through shattered whispers in the kitchen, Mrs. Whitman's urgent phone calls, Harold's grave expressions, the sudden presence of men in expensive suits who transformed the mansion's usual calm into something approaching chaos. The charges were specific and devastating: theft of confidential financial documents, corporate espionage, and betrayal of the trust that employment in the Aldrich household was supposed to represent. The evidence seemed damning in its simplicity. Corporate documents had been discovered in Maria's work locker, quarterly reports, investment summaries, and cryptocurrency transaction records that contained information worth millions to competitors who would pay handsomely for insider knowledge of Robert's business strategies. The papers bore her fingerprints from routine cleaning, transformed by suspicion into proof of activities far beyond her job description or moral character. Mrs. Whitman delivered the news with the cold efficiency that institutional loyalty demanded, her voice carrying disappointment that felt genuine despite its professional distance. The documents in question contained details about Aldrich Holdings' planned acquisition of downtown properties, information that could be worth fortunes to development companies competing for the same lucrative opportunities. Corporate security had been investigating leaks for months, and the evidence now pointed unmistakably toward the quiet woman who cleaned offices and had access to spaces where sensitive information was routinely discussed. Maria listened to the accusations with the same quiet dignity she brought to all her work, her hands folded in her lap as Mrs. Whitman outlined the severity of the charges and their potential consequences. Industrial espionage carried federal penalties that could destroy not just employment, but entire futures, transforming working mothers into convicted felons whose children would inherit shame along with their poverty. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, the opportunity obvious, and the motive, financial desperation, sadly predictable for someone in Maria's circumstances. Robert's reaction was swift and devastating in its completeness. The man who had shared garden soil under her fingernails, who had learned to appreciate simple meals prepared with care rather than expense, who had begun to remember his grandmother's wisdom about patience and growth, that man disappeared behind walls of corporate protection and personal betrayal. His voice, when he spoke to Maria for what would be the final time, carried the hollow distance of someone who had confused transaction with relationship, who had mistaken service for affection. "I trusted you," Robert said, the words falling between them like stones into still water. His office, where Maria had dusted books and watered plants with the reverence of someone who understood that spaces needed tending rather than merely maintaining, suddenly felt formal as a courtroom. The legal documents spread across his desk outlined penalties and consequences that money could impose when wealth felt threatened by those who served it. Maria's response was simple and shattering in its dignity. "I understand, Mr. Aldridge." She didn't protest her innocence or demand investigations that her words couldn't fund and her position couldn't command. Instead, she removed her apron with hands that trembled only slightly, folded it with the same care she had brought to every task, and placed it on the desk beside evidence that would transform her service into betrayal in the space between morning and evening. The other staff watched her departure with expressions ranging from satisfaction to sorrow. Some had always resented the special attention Maria seemed to receive, the way Mr. Aldridge had begun treating her more like family than employee. Others, particularly Rosa and Harold, understood that they were witnessing an injustice they couldn't prevent, and a loss that would change the house's character in ways that went beyond staffing adjustments. Thomas, who had learned to appreciate Maria's simple approaches to food and comfort, stood in the kitchen doorway as she gathered her few personal belongings, the small radio that had filled morning hours with music, the thermos that held coffee from home, the photograph of Carmen that had watched over her work from its place on the windowsill. His silence spoke volumes about institutional loyalty versus personal conviction, about the impossibility of defending the powerless when self-preservation demanded choosing sides. The conservatory, where Maria and Robert had planted hope alongside herbs, stood empty in the afternoon sunshine. The plants they had tended together continued growing, indifferent to human conflicts, their roots finding nourishment in soil that didn't distinguish between guilty and innocent hands. The irony was profound. Gardens flourished with care and attention, but human relationships could be destroyed by suspicion and circumstances that money could manipulate but couldn't ultimately control. Maria's bus ride back to Pilsen carried her through Chicago neighborhoods where security cameras couldn't follow and corporate investigators couldn't continue their surveillance. The city that had been her daily commute for months now felt different, not hostile, but somehow smaller, as if possibilities had been reduced along with employment prospects. Her reflection in the bus window showed the same weathered hands, the same dignified expression. But her eyes carried knowledge that morning hadn't brought, understanding that service could be transformed into suspicion at the convenience of those who commanded wealth. The apartment that had always been her sanctuary now felt like exile, its modest rooms insufficient to contain the humiliation and loss that unemployment would bring. Carmen's photograph smiled from the bedside table. Unaware that her mother's ability to afford fresh flowers for her grave was among the casualties of that morning's accusations. The poetry books that had provided comfort during previous crises offered no verses addressing circumstances where innocence couldn't purchase protection, and dignity provided insufficient defense against institutional power. As evening settled over Chicago, the mansion on Lakeshore Drive returned to its familiar quiet. The kitchen, which had briefly bloomed with warmth and life under Maria's care, reverted to the sterile perfection that money could maintain but couldn't animate. Robert's dinner, prepared by temporary staff who understood service but not nurture, was technically adequate but somehow insufficient, food that filled his stomach but left the deeper hungers unaddressed. The conservatory's plants continued their growth, indifferent to the human drama that had unfolded around their roots. Tomorrow would bring professional gardeners to maintain what Maria had inspired, but the soul of the space, the patient attention, the reverent care, the understanding that growth required more than water and fertilizer, had departed with the woman who had taught a millionaire that the most valuable things couldn't be purchased, only cultivated through daily devotion and trust. The truth emerged like sunrise after the longest night, slowly, inevitably, and with the power to transform everything it touched. 3 weeks after Maria's dismissal, while corporate investigators continued building their case against a woman who cleaned floors but had supposedly infiltrated million-dollar business strategies, Robert's accountant discovered discrepancies that pointed in an entirely different direction. The financial irregularities weren't the work of a desperate employee seeking to sell company secrets, but rather evidence of systematic embezzlement that had been occurring for months under the cover of corporate complexity and professional respectability. The real perpetrator was Jonathan Myers, Robert's most trusted financial advisor and the man who had helped build the cryptocurrency portfolio that now represented a significant portion of the Aldridge fortune. Myers had access to every document Maria had been accused of stealing, along with trading authorization that allowed him to manipulate investments for personal gain. The papers found in Maria's locker had been planted there during a morning when she was working in another part of the house, evidence manufactured by someone who understood how easily suspicion could be redirected from expensive suits to worn aprons. Robert's shock was profound and multi-layered: betrayal by someone he had considered a friend, guilt over his treatment of Maria, and rage at his own failure to investigate before passing judgment. Myers had exploited not just Robert's trust but his prejudices, counting on the assumption that a wealthy man would more readily suspect his cleaning lady than his investment advisor. The strategy had nearly succeeded, protecting millions in stolen assets while destroying the reputation of a woman whose only crime was having access to spaces where powerful men discussed business they assumed their employees couldn't understand or wouldn't dare remember. The federal investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Myers' operation, a network of insider trading and document theft that had been siphoning money from multiple high-net-worth clients across Chicago's financial district. Maria's fingerprints on the documents were explained by her routine cleaning duties, while Myers' manipulation of those same papers for illegal profit had required knowledge and access that no domestic employee could have possessed. The evidence was overwhelming, the motivation clear, and the method sophisticated enough to have succeeded if greed hadn't eventually demanded risks that careful investigation could uncover. Harold, who had witnessed Maria's departure with quiet sorrow, brought the news to Robert with expressions that mixed relief and reproach. The vindication was complete, but came too late to prevent the damage that accusations could cause in communities where reputation was often the only wealth working people possessed. Mrs. Whitman, typically controlled in her professional demeanor, allowing herself a moment of visible regret for her role in perpetuating assumptions that investigation had revealed to be prejudice dressed as prudence. The legal ramifications extended far beyond Myers' eventual imprisonment. Robert faced lawsuits from other victims who had trusted the financial advisor on his recommendation, regulatory investigations into his business practices, and media scrutiny that transformed his private mistakes into public embarrassment. The financial losses, while substantial, paled compared to the moral reckoning that came with understanding how thoroughly he had failed someone who deserved better treatment than his wealth had provided. Most painful was the recognition of his own complicity in a system that automatically suspected the powerless when powerful people felt threatened. Robert had spent months learning to appreciate Maria's wisdom, her dignity, her gentle strength, yet when crisis demanded choosing sides, he had instinctively protected his position rather than the person who had brought life back to his sterile mansion. The hypocrisy was complete and humiliating. He had trusted her to tend his home, but not her word when that home's security was questioned. The mansion itself seemed to mourn Maria's absence. The conservatory, despite professional maintenance, began showing signs of neglect that had nothing to do with watering schedules or fertilizer applications. Plants that had flourished under her patient attention now struggled, missing the intangible elements of care that couldn't be contracted or purchased. The kitchen, once warm with the evidence of someone who understood that homes needed more than cleaning, reverted to the sterile showcase it had been before her arrival. Thomas, who had learned from Maria that simple food prepared with love could nourish souls as well as bodies, found his elaborate culinary training inadequate for the basic task of providing comfort. The meals he prepared were technically perfect, but somehow empty, lacking the warmth that had made the kitchen a gathering place rather than merely a workspace. Even Harold, whose professional reserve typically prevented emotional display, admitted that the house felt different, colder, more formal, less alive despite the mechanical perfection that money maintained. The other staff members, who had watched Maria's departure with varying degrees of satisfaction and sorrow, now faced their own reckoning with the truth. Rosa, who had received Maria's quiet kindness and patient mentoring, felt particular shame at her failure to speak up when accusations were being made. The comfortable hierarchies that had once seemed natural and appropriate now revealed themselves as systems that protected some people while exposing others to dangers that justice should have prevented. As days passed into weeks, Robert's wealth continued generating the profits that financial advisors promised and investment strategies delivered. But the satisfaction that success had once provided was notably absent. The numbers in his accounts grew larger, while the emptiness in his daily life expanded, untouched by dividend payments or cryptocurrency appreciation. For the first time in his adult life, Robert began to understand that the most valuable things couldn't be quantified in market terms or protected by legal contracts. The slow process of locating Maria and attempting some form of reconciliation proved more complicated than money typically made problems. The address on her employment file led to an apartment building where she no longer lived, displaced by unemployment that had made rent payments impossible. The community in Pilsen, protective of their own and suspicious of wealthy outsiders seeking working people who had disappeared from view, provided no information that could help Robert find the woman he had wronged so thoroughly. His search for Maria became a kind of pilgrimage through parts of Chicago that his privileged life had rarely required him to notice. Job placement centers, community churches, the network of support services that helped working families survive economic disasters that employment at will policies made possible. Each inquiry revealed more about the vulnerability of people who lived paycheck to paycheck, whose financial security could be destroyed by accusations that investigation might eventually disprove, but immediate consequences would deliver regardless. The shame that Robert carried through this search was new to him, unfamiliar as a language he had never needed to learn. Wealth had always provided insulation from the consequences of his mistakes, lawyers and financial resources that could minimize damage and deflect responsibility. But this situation demanded something his money couldn't purchase and his position couldn't command: genuine humility, authentic remorse, and the recognition that some injuries couldn't be healed by compensation alone. 3 months after Maria's dismissal, Robert finally located her through a connection Rosa had reluctantly provided, not an address, but information about the community center in Pilsen, where Maria had been volunteering while searching for employment, that her tarnished reputation made nearly impossible to find. The building was modest, its walls decorated with murals celebrating the neighborhood's cultural heritage rather than expensive art collected for investment purposes. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had to travel to one of Chicago's poorest neighborhoods to find the woman who had briefly made his mansion feel like a home. Maria was in the center's kitchen, preparing meals for families whose children might otherwise go hungry during summer months when school nutrition programs weren't available. She wore the same expression of quiet dignity that had characterized her work at his mansion, her hands moving with the same gentle efficiency, whether she was cleaning a millionaire's floors or feeding community children whose parents worked multiple jobs for wages that wouldn't cover Robert's monthly wine budget. The recognition was mutual and immediate, but Maria's response wasn't what Robert had expected. Instead of anger or satisfaction at his obvious discomfort, her expression showed something closer to sadness, not for her own circumstances, but for the recognition that wealth hadn't taught him how to avoid the mistake he had made. She continued her work while he approached, neither welcoming nor rejecting his presence, simply acknowledging it with the same calm acceptance she had shown for everything else life had required her to endure. "Mrs. Esperanza," Robert began, then stopped, realizing that the formal address he had always used was inadequate for the conversation they needed to have. The kitchen around them buzzed with activity. Volunteers preparing food, children setting tables, families arriving for shared meals that community cooperation made possible despite individual poverty. The warmth and life in this modest space contrasted sharply with the expensive emptiness of his mansion, where money could purchase service but couldn't create the genuine care that filled this room. "Maria," he said finally, her first name feeling foreign but more honest on his tongue. "I came to apologize." The words were simple, but they carried weight that no amount of money could have purchased. Around them, the work continued, evidence that life in places like this didn't pause for wealthy people's moral reckonings, that survival required daily attention to needs that couldn't wait for apologies or explanations. Maria's response was characteristic, direct, dignified, and free from the bitterness that circumstances might have justified. "Apologies don't change what happened, Mr. Aldridge, but they help with what happens next." Her hands continued working while she spoke, preparing food that would nourish children whose parents trusted this community space in ways that money couldn't replicate or replace. The conversation that followed was unlike any Robert had ever experienced, not a negotiation or a business transaction, but a genuine attempt at understanding between two people whose lives had intersected in ways that both had found meaningful despite the vast differences in their circumstances. Maria spoke without anger about the months of unemployment, the struggle to find work when accusations of theft, even disproven ones, followed her through Chicago's connected network of domestic employment agencies. More importantly, she spoke about disappointment that had nothing to do with lost wages or damaged reputation. The garden they had tended together, the conversations over simple meals, the gradual warming of a house that had been beautiful but lifeless, those things had meant something beyond employment, had represented a connection that transcended the economic relationship of employer and employee. Robert's immediate assumption of her guilt had revealed that despite months of shared work and conversation, he had never really seen her as someone whose word deserved the same respect he automatically gave to people who shared his social class. The forgiveness that Maria eventually offered was characteristic of her approach to everything, quiet, dignified, and more concerned with moving forward than dwelling on past injuries. She didn't require dramatic gestures or public vindication, understanding that the real healing would come through changed behavior rather than compensatory payments. Her grace in the face of genuine wrong was more devastating to Robert than anger would have been, revealing the depth of character that wealth couldn't purchase and education couldn't guarantee. As evening approached and the community center prepared to close, Robert found himself reluctant to leave this space where Maria's quiet strength had found new purposes and meaningful work. The contrast with his empty mansion was profound. Here, surrounded by families whose financial resources were modest, but whose connections to each other provided wealth that his money couldn't replicate, he witnessed the kind of life that he had briefly glimpsed during those months when Maria had brought warmth to spaces that luxury couldn't enliven. The invitation that Maria eventually extended was simple and profound. "The garden will need attention soon. Plants don't care about our complications. They just need water and patience." It was an offer of redemption that required no lawyers, no contracts, no financial negotiations, just the willingness to show up, to work beside someone he had wronged, and to tend growing things that would flourish or fail based on the daily care they received, rather than the amount of money that had been invested in their purchase. As Robert left the community center that evening, walking through neighborhoods where his name on FBI wanted lists would have made him more notorious than his business success ever had, he carried with him something more valuable than any investment return: the possibility of rebuilding trust through the same patient attention that Maria brought to everything she touched, and the understanding that the most important growth happened gradually, requiring time and care that no amount of wealth could hurry, but genuine attention could nurture toward flourishing. 6 months later, The Aldridge mansion had undergone a transformation that interior designers couldn't have planned and money couldn't have purchased. Maria had returned not as an employee, but as something unprecedented in Robert's experience, a partner in the slow work of creating a home rather than merely maintaining a showcase. The legal settlements and financial restitution had been handled efficiently, but the real rebuilding required daily attention to details that contracts couldn't specify and compensation couldn't guarantee. The conservatory flourished under their renewed collaboration, its herbs and vegetables providing ingredients for meals that nourished more than bodies. The kitchen had once again become the house's heart, warm with conversation and the comfortable silence of people who understood each other's working rhythms. But the most significant change was less tangible and more profound. The mansion now felt inhabited rather than simply occupied, alive with the evidence that someone cared about the spaces and the people who moved through them. Robert's business empire continued generating enormous profits. His cryptocurrency investments reached new heights of value, and his real estate holdings expanded across Chicago's most desirable neighborhoods. But these successes now served different purposes than they once had. Wealth became a tool for creating community rather than purchasing isolation, for building connections rather than maintaining distance. The mansion's gates, once barriers protecting privacy, now opened regularly to welcome neighbors, volunteers, and children who transformed expensive spaces into places where life flourished. The weekly dinners that Maria organized drew people from both worlds. Her friends from Pilsen, alongside Robert's business associates, community volunteers sharing tables with investment advisors, children from the neighborhood center playing in rooms that had once displayed art for admiration rather than enjoyment. These gatherings succeeded because Maria understood something about hospitality that wealth couldn't teach, that the most memorable meals were created through attention to people rather than impression management, through genuine care rather than expensive presentation. Harold, who had witnessed the mansion's transformation from sterile showcase to living home, often remarked that the house now felt the way houses were supposed to feel, warm, welcoming, alive with daily evidence that people who cared about each other shared its spaces. Thomas found his culinary skills finally matched to their proper purpose, preparing food that brought people together rather than simply displaying technical competence. Even Mrs. Whitman, typically reserved in her emotional expressions, admitted that the house had become what she had always hoped such places could be, proof that wealth could serve life rather than simply showcasing success. The garden that Robert and Maria tended together had expanded beyond the conservatory to include sections of the mansion's grounds previously maintained by landscaping services, but never truly cultivated. Their weekend work sessions drew neighbors who learned that wealthy people could get their hands dirty alongside anyone else. That soil didn't distinguish between expensive clothes and thrift store purchases when it came to the labor of planting and harvesting. These gardening sessions became informal classes where Maria's practical knowledge combined with Robert's resources to create opportunities for people who couldn't afford their own garden spaces but could contribute labor and enthusiasm to shared growing projects. Children learned that food came from plants rather than stores. Adults discovered talents they hadn't known they possessed, and elderly neighbors shared wisdom about techniques that no agricultural college could provide, but experience had proven reliable. The produce from these expanded gardens supplied not just the mansion's kitchen, but the community center where Maria continued volunteering, creating a closed loop where resources supported the people who had helped create them. Robert learned that investment returns weren't always measured in dollars, that money spent on soil and seeds could generate dividends in community connection and personal satisfaction that stock portfolios couldn't provide. His children, Tommy and Emma, had resumed their visits to Chicago with enthusiasm that had been missing for years. The mansion they returned to bore little resemblance to the sterile showcase they remembered from their parents' marriage. Now the spaces buzzed with life, friends from the neighborhood joining them for homework sessions, adults from different backgrounds sharing stories over meals that felt more like celebrations than obligations, and Maria's constant presence providing the stability and warmth that their father's wealth had been unable to guarantee. Emma, now 16 and possessed of the idealism that adolescence could nurture when supported properly, announced her intention to spend the summer working at the community center rather than attending the expensive camps that money could purchase, but her heart didn't desire. Tommy, 3 years younger but wise beyond his years in the way children could be when their emotional needs were being met, declared that the mansion's garden was better than any video game because you could eat what you created and share it with people you liked. Caroline, their mother, had initially viewed the changes in Robert's life with skepticism, born of experience with his previous commitments to personal transformation. But the evidence was overwhelming and consistent. Phone calls that no longer interrupted family dinners, weekends devoted to activities that included the children rather than simply accommodating them, and a house that finally felt like a place where family memories could be created rather than money displayed. The legal resolution of the Jonathan Myers case had provided vindication for Maria and justice for all the investors who had been victimized. But more importantly, it had contributed to Robert's education about systems that protected some people while exposing others to dangers that justice was supposed to prevent. His testimony during the trial had been straightforward and devastating, describing not just the financial crimes, but the personal betrayal that had nearly succeeded because of assumptions that wealth was supposed to protect against, but had actually enabled. The community respect that Maria enjoyed in Pilsen now extended to Robert, earned through consistent presence rather than charitable donations, through participation rather than patronage. Children who had initially been impressed by the size of his car and the expense of his clothes now valued him for qualities that money couldn't purchase. His willingness to listen to their stories, his patience with their questions about business and money, his genuine interest in their dreams and concerns. The mansion's transformation from showcase to home represented more than interior design changes or lifestyle adjustments. It had become proof that wealth could serve purposes beyond accumulation and display, that success could be measured in ways that bank statements couldn't quantify. The house now demonstrated daily that the most valuable investments weren't always financial, that the best returns came from attention paid to people and places rather than portfolios and properties. As autumn painted Chicago in shades of gold and crimson, Maria and Robert worked side by side in the garden, harvesting vegetables that would feed families throughout the community while planning next year's expansion. Their partnership had evolved beyond friendship into something rarer and more valuable, a collaboration based on mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that the most important work couldn't be completed by individuals alone, but required community effort and sustained attention. The mansion that had once symbolized Robert's isolation now served as evidence that wealth, when combined with wisdom and guided by genuine care for others, could create beauty that served life rather than simply displaying success. Maria's quiet strength had indeed brought down a millionaire, not through corporate espionage or financial manipulation, but by demonstrating that the most profitable investments were made in human connection, community building, and the patient cultivation of relationships that could flourish when tended with the same attention that successful gardens required. Years would pass, seasons would cycle through their eternal rhythm, but the foundation they had built together, rooted in forgiveness, nurtured by shared work, and flourishing through daily attention to the needs of others, would continue growing, providing shelter and nourishment for everyone whose life it touched, proving that some forms of wealth could only be created through the collaboration of hands willing to work together regardless of the different worlds from which they came. And you, have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Have you witnessed the quiet power that comes from dignity maintained despite circumstances that tested every ounce of strength you possessed? Tell me your story in the comments below. If Maria's journey touched your heart, If her quiet courage reminded you of your own unrecognized strength, leave a like and subscribe so this story reaches another woman who needs to remember that the most valuable treasures can't be stolen because they exist in hearts that no amount of money can purchase or poverty can diminish. For more stories that honor the invisible work that holds the world together, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this emotional road with us, for understanding that the most profound transformations happen gradually, like gardens growing toward the light. We'll see you in the next story, where ordinary people discover extraordinary strength in the spaces between what money can buy and what hearts can build together.